Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of digital fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and today we have both Day 2 and Day 3 of spoiler season for Duskmourn to go over all in the same video. Now, Day 2 of spoiler season, we didn't get a whole lot of spoilers. It didn't make sense to do an entire full-length video on Day 2. But then Day 3 came, and it seems like they dropped a nuke on us as far as how many crazy spoilers that they released. So we have all of those to cover and the leftovers from Day 2. We're going to try to get through them as quick as possible, so we're going to get right to it. Before we do, make sure you like the video if you haven't already. It's you guys liking every video that has helped this channel to grow so quickly. We're approaching 11,000 subscribers already, and that's all because of you guys, so thank you so much. Smash that like button. Also, if you're new here, make sure you subscribe so you never miss an upload. Tons of crazy spoiler content on the way, trying to hit the ground running and get these cards out to you as soon as possible so that we're one of the first channels to have those spoilers for you to check out. I'm working really hard behind the scenes to do that, and we do have a ton of deck techs on the way as well. We've got some leftover ideas from Bloomborough that I'm hard at work on, and I've got some new crazy ideas I'm working on for Duskmourn already. I am going to be a part of the Duskmourn Early Access happening on September 18th. I'm going to do a 24-hour marathon stream where we're going to just do as many crazy, ridiculous new standard decks that I can come up with as possible, and then all of those deck techs are going to hit the YouTube channel super quick before the set's even out on Arena for you guys, and we're going to get all that stuff out to you as quick as we can, so make sure you subscribe. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's get on to the cards. First up, we have Tyvar the Pummeler. This is a 3/3 legendary elf warrior for 2 green and 1. You can tap another untapped creature you control, and Tyvar the Pummeler gains indestructible until end of turn, but you have to tap Tyvar if he's untapped. Also, you can pay 5 mana, and creatures you control get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. So, the mana sink, the ability to buff up your whole team by whatever is the greatest power, is pretty awesome, but really what makes this card special is that tap ability, and particularly in this set, it's a little bit better than it would be otherwise because we have the survivor mechanic in this set. If you guys haven't seen that mechanic yet, I'm pretty sure there's some cards that are going to appear in this video, but there were definitely some that were in the first spoiler video, so I would urge you guys to check out that video if you haven't yet. But the survivor mechanic, the way it works is that in your post-combat main phase, if a creature is tapped, it gets some kind of a benefit, or it triggers some kind of an ability. So the idea here is, if you're swinging in with a creature with Survivor, and they don't die in combat, they survive, you get some value afterwards, which is really awesome. It's a really interesting mechanic, but obviously, even though it doesn't thematically fit, mechanically you can kind of break this a little bit by finding other ways to tap your creatures. So Tyvar gives you a way to tap your other creatures without spending any mana whatsoever to start turning on their survivor abilities without necessarily having to swing in with them and risk losing them in combat. So I do feel like there could be a really cool deck with Tyvar at the center that, you know, utilizes that survivor mechanic, and I'm excited to see where it goes. So very cool card here. Next up, we have a cycle of common dual lands, and we're calling these the unlucky lands or the bad luck lands. All of these lands are kind of interesting. I want to go out on a limb and say they're probably the best common dual land cycle we've ever seen, or at least in a long time, because they have the ability to enter the battlefield untapped, which we don't normally see for common dual lands. It's very, very rare to see a common dual land be able to enter untapped. And the requirement is kind of interesting, such as Abandoned Campground here. It enters tapped unless a player has 13 or less life, and then it taps for either white or blue. And there's one for every single color combination, not just the allied colors or just the enemy colors, but all 10 color combinations, which is really interesting. What's cool about the 13 or less life thing is it doesn't just work if you have 13 or less, or if just your opponent does. It can work either way. So if you play these in a very aggressive deck, you can just burn your opponent's life total down to 13 or less as quick as possible, and then all of your lands start coming into play untapped. Or you could play it in a deck where you're spending a bunch of your life and getting yourself to 13 as quick as possible, and they can all start coming into play untapped in those decks as well. So there's sort of versatility in how these can be used, And I think these are mainly meant for limited. I don't necessarily expect them to show up in constructed, but what I will say, out of all of the cycles of common dual lands we've seen over the past handful of years, I think these are the ones that have the best chance of showing up in constructed because they do have a way to enter untapped, which is, like I said before, just not usually the case for common dual lands. But we have Abandoned Campground here for Azorius, and then Murky Sewer for Dimir, Razor Trap Gorge for Rakdos, Etched Cornfield for Selesnya, Neglected Manor for Orzhov, Strangled Cemetery for Golgari, Lakeside Shack for Simic, Bleeding Woods for Gruul, Peculiar Lighthouse for Izzet, and Raucous Carnival for Boros. So, honestly, pretty interesting cards. I'm excited to see if these actually end up seeing play in constructed, but they should be really good in limited. Next up, we've got Fear of Imposters. This is 2 blue and 1 for a 3/2 enchantment creature nightmare with flash, and when it enters, you counter target spell and its controller manifests dread. A flash creature that can counter a spell for 3 mana that has 3 power is already pretty good just by itself. Now, obviously it manifests dread for your opponent when you counter something, but that's probably worth it. If you're countering something really substantial like an Atraxa or an Atali, giving them a crappy little 2/2 is probably okay. There's also ways you can use this on yourself. Maybe you can counter your own spell if you want to manifest dread, stuff like that. You can also reuse it by flickering it, so there's a lot of potential to explore with a card like this. I think it's pretty interesting. I think it's going to be especially powerful in Limited, because Limited has been very bomby lately ever since they introduced the play boosters, and there's an increased amount of rares and special guest cards showing up in Limited, in Draft, and in Sealed. It's been a very bomby format, and I expect that to continue with this set, so if bombs are ruling the day and really deciding outcomes, being able to counter a key bomb and only giving them a 2/2 in exchange might be super good in Limited, so be really interesting to see exactly where this card fits in. But next up, we've got Shepherding Spirits. This is a 4/5 spirit with flying for 2 white and 4. It also has plane cycling too, so not that great. It is a common, but it is a nice win condition that can come down later in the game. But if you have it early, you can use it to mana fix, find your white mana source, or if you don't have 2 white mana sources yet, even if you do have the 6 land, you can just use it to find your second white source. And then, you know, later on, if you happen to draw into a second one, now you can actually cast it. So I like seeing these cards where they can be fixing early in the game, but they can be a relevant threat that can win the game for you, even if it is a bit overcosted late in the game. I think that pairs up really well, and seeing this at the common rarity is really nice. It does make me wonder if spirits are going to be an actual supported tribe in this set, or if it's just, you know, going to have a bunch of spirits for flavor. But moving on, we've got Ghost Vacuum. This is a 1 mana artifact. You can tap it to exile target card from a graveyard, and then you can pay 6, tap it, and sacrifice it to put each creature card exiled with Ghost Vacuum onto the battlefield under your control with a flying counter on it, and each of them is a 1/1 spirit in addition to its other types, activate only as a sorcery. Having a 1 mana artifact that can just once a turn for free for no mana, just by tapping, just exile a card from a graveyard, is already going to be kind of good in certain situations. It might be good in sideboards, taking out key cards that your opponent needs, like flashback cards, but also messing with their Delirium and with their Threshold and all of that sort of stuff is really nice. And then just later on in the game, it's a win condition, right? It sits there doing its job, and then at some point you get to 6 mana, you crack it, you get a whole bunch of flying 1/1s. Now granted, they're only going to be 1/1, but they're going to keep all of their abilities. They could be super relevant because of that, and it's going to be a little bit better in decks that utilize things that come into play with +1/+1 counters, because even though they're 1/1s, they'll still get those +1/+1 counters and be bigger threats, so that might be a way you can build around it too. But just seeing this as just a silly little 1 mana artifact that can just start getting you value so early in the game and then have a huge payoff later, I kind of like it. I don't know if it's good enough yet, but it's definitely going to be fun to experiment with this stuff, and there is some potential for sure. But next up, we have Ghostly Keybearer. 1 blue and 3 for a 3/3 Flying Spirit. And whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you unlock a locked door of up to 1 target room you control. I have a feeling that this is going to be really good in the Rooms Matter archetype in Limited specifically, being able to get 2 or 3 of these in a draft and constantly just fly past your opponent's blockers and unlock your rooms without having to pay their costs is going to be insane, especially because most of the rooms we've seen so far have had one side that's kind of cheap and one side that's really expensive. So you can play the cheap side, get it out quick, and then this guy can just swing in and unlock the expensive side immediately, and you can really go to town. So in Limited, I think this guy is going to be really amazing, and he's going to be first pickable if you're going deep into rooms. In Constructed, hard to say. Cards like this are usually a little bit too expensive, die to removal, that sort of thing, to actually pan out. I do think the Room archetype deck is going to be a thing in Standard, but I'm not entirely sure that this card makes the cut. Next up, we've got Patched Plaything, 1 white and 2 for a 4/3 artifact creature toy with double strike, and it enters with 2 -1/-1 counters on it if you cast it from your hand. This card's kind of awesome. 3 mana for a 2/1 double striker isn't that bad to begin with. It isn't great, but it isn't awful either. But if you could just flicker this thing, it's going to come back onto the battlefield without those -1/-1 counters and be a ridiculous threat that can swing in for 8 damage, which is insane. Also, if you cast it from exile in a deck that is specifically trying to like exile cards from the top of your library and you can cast them until end of turn, like that sort of mechanic, you just play this from exile and it's just a 3 mana 4/3 double striker, which is absolutely bonkers. You can also return it from the graveyard, or, you know, there's tons of little ways in which you can get this into play without technically casting it from your hand to avoid having those counters. And like I said before too, just flickering it, even if you do have to hard cast it, but you're in a deck where you're flickering things constantly, being able to flicker this and reset it is kind of insane as well. So really cool card. Excited to see how good it ends up being in Limited specifically. I'm not sure how many consistent ways there are going to be at lower rarities to actually get this into play without casting it from your hand, but I'm hoping there's a number of ways, because I think this would be really fun in Limited if you can get it to be consistent enough. Next up, we've got Grievous Wound. This is another rare. It's 2 black and 3 for an enchantment aura. Enchants a player. Enchanted player can't gain life. And whenever enchanted player is dealt damage, they lose half their life, rounded up. This card's kind of bananas. It almost reminds me of that other 5-drop enchantment where whenever an opponent casts a spell, they lose 5 life or discard a card. It reminds me a little bit of that card. I forget what that card is called. If you remember, let me know in the comments. But the problem with that card is it felt kind of win more. By the time you got it out, you could have probably already won with other cards anyway. It was a bit expensive. This feels a little bit like that, but what's cool about this is I could definitely see it being the center of a very crazy combo deck, because it's any time the enchanted player is dealt any damage at all, they lose half their life. So if you're in a deck where you can just ping them a couple times, this can get really crazy, because you ping them, they lose half their life, you ping them, they lose half their life. You could just burn out their life total really, really quick if you have just the right ways to sort of get value and synergize off of Grievous Wound, and I'm excited to see if that ends up being a thing. So if you have ideas about what kind of cards you would use this with to really get the most out of it, definitely let me know in the comments, because I feel like the potential is there. Next up, we have Unwilling Vessel. This is 1 blue and 2 for a 3/2 human wizard with vigilance. When Unwilling Vessel dies, create an XX blue spirit creature token with flying, where X is the number of counters on Unwilling Vessel. And how do you get those counters? It has the Eerie keyword ability. And Eerie is a keyword ability that triggers whenever you either play an enchantment or I should say whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield. You don't have to actually play it. Any way at all that an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control will trigger Eerie, but Eerie will also trigger if you unlock a room on a room card. So sort of extra ways to get Eerie to trigger and to get more value out of it. This card in particular, whenever an enchantment you control enters and whenever you fully unlock a room, you put a possession counter on the Unwilling Vessel. So it gets more and more counters the more rooms you unlock, the more enchantments you play, and then eventually it gives you this huge flying spirit token when the Unwilling Vessel dies. So pretty cool card. I think it's going to be really good in Limited particularly because there's so much room to explore this, pardon the pun. Again, this is one of those cards that I don't know if the constructed room deck ends up having room for something like this. Room. It might just be, you know, I feel like it might take a little too long to set up to really be worth the payoff, but it could make the cut. We'll have to wait and see. But moving on, we've got Glimmer Seeker. This is 1 white and 2 for a 3/3 human survivor. And this card has that survival mechanic I brought up at the beginning of the video. So at the beginning of your second main phase, if Glimmer Seeker is tapped, you draw a card if you control a Glimmer creature. If you don't control a Glimmer creature, you create a 1/1 white Glimmer enchantment creature token. I really like this card. I think it's going to be amazing in Limited, and it might even see play in Constructed. A 3/3 for 3 isn't amazing, but it's good enough, right? And the 3/3 body does mean it has an okay chance of actually surviving combat without having to find other tricks and other ways to tap this thing to turn on its survival. So being able to just swing in, survive a combat, make a 1/1 token, and then from that point on, as long as you still have that token, every time you swing in and survive, you're drawing a card. Being able to have that card draw at, you know, the uncommon rarity for Limited is pretty crazy, and will definitely be worth a lot in Limited for sure. Now, really the question is how many different ways of creating Glimmer creatures are going to be in this set, because if there are a ton of ways of getting other Glimmer creatures onto the battlefield and not necessarily relying on this to make one, being able to like play a Glimmer creature on turn 2 and then play this, and the first time you swing in with it, you know, you get to draw a card immediately. You don't have to go through that, you know, turn where you're making the token or whatever. That could make this card that much better. So, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But next up, we've got Leyline of Resonance. This is part of the new Leyline cycle. It is confirmed. We're getting 5 Leylines, one of which is a reprint, which we will talk about later. But this is Leyline of Resonance, 2 red and 2 for an enchantment. If it's in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it on the battlefield, which is already pretty awesome, just like every Leyline. And whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell that targets only a single creature you control, you copy that spell, and you may choose new targets for the copy. So I think this is a Leyline that's meant to be in the mono red or is it prowess decks that we've seen running rampant in Standard lately, you know, with Slick Shot Show Off and, you know, that kind of deck, maybe Otter Tribal, that sort of thing, and really double down on trying to play buff spells on your creatures because you get to double them. The fact that this could start on the battlefield and you don't ever have to pay for it and just all of your spells are just doubled from turn 1 is kind of crazy. So I'm a little bit worried this might be too much gas for that deck in Standard. At the same time, this might be a bit of a trap for that deck because how often are you going to get stuck with it in your hand as sort of a dead card where by the time you have the mana to play it, you're kind of out of gas and don't have any spells left to play? So I'm not sure. It could go either way, but I'm excited to find out. Next up, we have Grasping Longneck. This is another common. It's a 4/2 enchantment creature horror for 1 green and 2. It has reach, and when it dies, you gain 2 life. I kind of love this guy. It trades up really well, gives you some extra value when it dies, and it counts as an enchantment. It can even block big flyers. I think this is a really good card as far as the rarity, right? For Limited, this is going to fill a hole you really, really want, especially against certain decks where they have really crazy, like, scary flyers that you need to worry about. I wonder how much a creature being an enchantment is really going to matter in this set and how many enchantment payoffs we're going to have, because this card could get that much better if we have a lot of different ways to have enchantment payoffs. So, pretty interesting. Since it counts as an enchantment, it will trigger eerie stuff when you play it, so it's cool to have creatures that can do that, and those might line up really well in the same deck. But moving on, we have Fear of Isolation. This is 1 blue and 1 for an enchantment creature Nightmare. It's a 2/3 with flying, and as an additional cost to cast the spell, you return a permanent you control to its owner's hand. So this is sort of a slightly more expensive Nurturing Pixie, in a way. 2 mana, 2/3 flyer that just, you return something to its owner's hand. You kind of have to return something. With the Pixie, you got a counter if you did, and it only costs 1 mana. So I do think the Pixie is kind of better. But in Limited, Fear of Isolation is going to be really, really good, specifically if you're in a deck where recasting things can get you a lot of value, ETB creatures, or maybe something that came out as a lesser version early on, and now you have enough mana to play it as something greater. You can bounce it to your hand and replay it. So I do think there's some value to be had in this in Limited. I don't think it'll quite make the cut in Constructed. At first glance, I thought this might be copies 5 through 8 of Nurturing Pixie for a new kind of maybe like Esper Nurturing Pixie deck, but I don't think it's quite good enough. I don't think it really makes the cut, although it could. It might. Keep your eyes peeled. We'll have to wait and see. But next up, we've got Leyline of the Void. This is that reprint I told you about earlier. This is the black Leyline from the Leyline cycle. Kinda bummed we don't have a new black Leyline, but it is what it is. 2 black and 2 for an enchantment. If it's in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it on the battlefield, and if a card will be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. What I particularly like about this card is that it only works on your opponent's stuff. It doesn't exile your stuff. There are a lot of mechanics in this set that care about graveyard and what sort of state your graveyard is in, like Delirium and that sort of thing. So being able to still have access to those synergies yourself and then completely cut your opponent out of them is pretty cool. So I don't know if this quite makes the cut in any decks, maybe as a sideboard card. I'm not even sure if it's good enough to play in Limited, to be honest, because there are situations in which the card is just a dead card. So I don't know. Jury's out on this one. Probably not good enough in Limited. Probably relegated to the sideboard and Constructed. But next up, we've got Clockwork Percussionist. This is 1 red for a 1/1 artifact creature monkey toy with haste. And when it dies, you exile the top card of your library. You may play it until the end of your next turn. Man, Wizards is really going ham with 2-for-1s lately, right? Like, it seems like every creature has extra value it gets you, even the common 1-drops, right? A 1/1 haste isn't that bad to begin with. One that's an artifact creature that gets you a little bit of artifact synergy for decks that care about that is, you know, a little bit of extra spice. But the fact that it just replaces itself with a card that you can play until the end of your next turn is nuts. It's not even just this turn. It's until the end of your next turn. And that's not like a crazy card in the grand scheme of things. But for a common, it kind of is, right? Getting access to an automatic 2-for-1 at the common slot, pretty nice. That's I guess power creep for you. But next up, we've got Patchwork Beastie. I almost said Patchwork Bestie. 3/3 artifact creature beast for just 1 green mana. It has Delirium and can't attack or block unless there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard. And at the beginning of your upkeep, you may mill a card. So, sure, it is in the 3/3 early, but I love that this thing can come down on turn 1 for just the 1 mana, start milling you a card every single turn. It reminds me of the Fungus dude that did that a number of sets back. I forget the name of that off the top of my head, but I ran it a lot with Willowgeist. If you remember, let me know in the comments. But yeah, just something you can get down super quick and just start to self-mill in the decks that want to do that is actually really good. The fact that all it takes is Delirium to turn it into a 3/3 and not necessarily getting like Threshold or a ton of cards in your graveyard, just very specific cards that get you 4 different card types. And you got to remember, cards can be multiple types and fulfill multiple pieces of the Delirium puzzle, so to speak. Like Patchwork Beastie here as an example. It's both an artifact and a creature. You play this on 1, you mill a card, and the card you mill is another Patchwork Beastie. You're already halfway to turning on Delirium. So I think this card's a little bit better than it looks. I think Delirium in general is going to be a little bit better than it looks on the surface because there's just so many cards in this set that have 2 types. There's artifact creatures, there's enchantment creatures, there's a bunch of stuff. So I think this is pretty cool. I'm excited to see if it's relegated to just Limited or if there's some kind of a constructed deck. Maybe Insidious Roots really wants to use this. I don't know if it's quite good enough, but it's definitely possible. We'll have to wait and see. But next up, we've got Undead Sprinter. This is 2 mana for a 2/2 zombie with trample and haste, which is already pretty decent, especially if you're going zombie tribal, right? And you have ways of buffing it up. But you may cast Undead Sprinter from your graveyard if a non-zombie creature died this turn. If you do, it enters with a +1/+1 counter on it. I kind of love this ability. It just keeps coming back over and over and over. You don't have to pay more than the initial 2 mana cost every time that you bring it back. It's not like because it comes in as a bigger creature from the graveyard, it's costing you more mana to do it. Nope, you just pay the casting cost, and you get a 3/3 trample haste that can swing in right away. And I like that it doesn't require a non-token creature to die, right? It just needs to be a non-zombie. So if you have like an 𝐒𝑟𝑟𝑎𝑐ℎ Forge or something like that, anything that's making token creatures, and a token just dies in combat, as long as it's not a zombie, you can bring back the Undead Sprinter. Just from tokens dying. 𝐒𝑟𝑟𝑎𝑐ℎ Forge is the perfect example because it's going to make a token every single turn. So if that token gets blocked and dies in combat, or if you have a way to sacrifice that token, any way of getting that token off the field before the end of turn, you can very easily just bring back the Undead Sprinter in your second main over and over and over again, because every single turn the 𝐒𝑟𝑟𝑎𝑐ℎ Forge is going to give you a token to, you know, have die to sacrifice or what have you, die in combat, whatever it might be, and give you the potential, the opportunity to bring back the Undead Sprinter. So, I don't know. I'm excited. I'm just excited to see how people use this. Let's move on. Can you tell I'm excited? This is Fear of Failed Tests. 1 blue and 4 for a 2/7 enchantment creature nightmare. And whenever Fear of Failed Test deals combat damage to a player, you draw that many cards. This is expensive, but it's kind of awesome. Like, in Limited, a 2/7 that draws you 2 cards every time it deals combat damage is kind of significant, right? Even if it does cost 5, 5 isn't the worst ever. The fact that it has like double Curiosity on it, it draws you 2 cards, and if you buff it up, it deals even more. I think this guy is going to be kind of a sleeper in Limited, in particular, where if you have the right decks where you can buff up your creatures, being able to swing in and draw an entire new grip of cards off a very carefully planned combat step with this guy could be absolutely insane. That being said, it kind of needs to be in the right deck to be really good, but even not in that deck, coming down on 5 and being an insanely good blocker, slowing down your opponent's aggro, and then taking your time to get to a point where maybe it can swing in and start drawing you cards, even that is kind of okay. So I'm excited to see how good this just ends up being in practice. It's not... It has the potential, right? It has the potential to be really good. It also has the potential to be just kind of okay. So we'll see where it goes. But next up, we have Drag to the Roots. This is 4 mana for an instant, 1 green, 1 black, and 2. It has Delirium, so it costs 2 less to cast as long as there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard. We already talked about how that's easier to fill in this set than it would be normally in any other set because there's so many things with 2 card types. And then you just destroy target non-land permanent. So a lot of times, the decks that this is going to be used in, it's just going to be 2 mana, instant speed, destroy any non-land permanent, which is going to be really, really, really good. Really good. But even if you don't turn on the Delirium, 4 mana at instant speed to destroy any non-land permanent isn't awful, right? It isn't awful. It's not great, but it's not awful. It's definitely runnable, especially in Limited. Even without the Delirium, I think this card is good in Limited. Not great, but good in Limited. If you have even a little bit of potential to turn on Delirium at a turn that is relevant in the game still, this thing shoots up to really good in Limited. Will it make the cut in Constructed? I don't know, maybe. Maybe in Roots decks, maybe in decks that can fill up the graveyard easy. But in Limited, this thing is going to be nuts. It's going to probably be picked pretty high, but it is going to push you into very specific archetypes that Golgari can actually be a strong contender for when you do end up playing this. Moving on, we've got Overlord of the Flood Pits. This is a 5/3 enchantment creature avatar horror for 2 blue and 3. It has flying. Whenever it enters or attacks, you get to draw 2 cards and then discard a card. All of that is kind of okay by itself. Not amazing, but still good, right? But what makes this card so insane is the impending 4. It only costs 2 blue and 1. and it comes into play with 4 time counters on it. At the end of your turn, you remove a time counter. When the last one gets removed, it becomes the creature version of itself. So it enters as a non-creature enchantment if you pay the impending cost. When the last time counter's gone, now it's the creature version, as if you had just hardcast it. Or you can just hardcast this a little bit later in the game and just have it come into play as a creature immediately. I like the versatility. Most of the overlords, most of the impending creatures we've seen so far have a very expensive mana cost where it's not nearly as reasonable to hardcast them. This guy's isn't so bad, so I like the versatility of you can jam it out early, or you can just top deck it later in the game and not have too much trouble just slamming it out, getting it onto the board when it matters. What I especially like about the impending mechanic, and continues to be true for this card, is the fact that it works so well with things like All Will Be One that care about counters, because you're paying less mana to come into play with counters that are all going to trigger All Will Be One, so it's kind of a win-win situation. But this one in particular too, since it's blue, it reminds me a lot of Zor, and how good Zor is with certain enchantments that are expensive. Any enchantments at all that you can get into play for cheaper than what their actual printed converted mana cost is, that have a higher printed converted mana cost, any card like that is going to be really good with Zur. We already saw that with Leyline Binding, where you can get the Leyline Binding out for just a couple mana, but it still counts as a 6-drop. So when you turn it into a creature with Zur, it becomes a 6/6. The same is true for all of these impending creatures. They come into play for their impending cost, and you don't even need to worry about removing the time counters because you use Zur's ability to just pay 2 mana, turn it into a creature. Not only is it a creature immediately, you don't have to waste the 4 turns, but it's actually a bigger creature because the power and toughness becomes equal to the mana cost. So it becomes a 5/5 instead of a 5/3. It becomes that immediately. It still has the flying, and then it gets all the crazy keywords that, you know, Zur gives to enchantment creatures. So pretty insane with Zur, pretty insane with All Will Be One. Lots of ways to brew around these impending creatures, and I'm really, really looking forward to it. The fact that this one gives you repeatable card advantage makes it just that much better. So really cool card, and I am incredibly excited. But next up, we've got Infernal Phantom. This is 1 red and 3 for a 2/3 spirit with Eerie. So whenever an enchantment you control enters, and whenever you fully unlock a room, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. Also, when it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. Now, what's cool about this is it's not limited to once a turn, right? So if you're able to just spam a whole bunch of enchantments out all at once, or able to just unlock a whole bunch of room cards all at once, this can buff up to an insane power, and then you can like sacrifice it and it's basically a fling, just do whatever damage to anything. Or you can swing in if they don't have a blocker, or maybe they do, you swing in and you get to kill something and do a bunch of damage. Like, there's definitely potential here, right? I don't know if unlocking rooms is the way to go necessarily with this one, since you want to try to trigger that Eerie as many times in a turn as possible. I feel like the cheaper way to do that is in some kind of an enchantment deck where you're playing a bunch of enchantments all in the same turn. But yeah, I really like this Eerie keyword, and this card, kind of scary, gonna be amazing and limited, even if it doesn't end up making the cut and constructed, because it's a creature with removal tacked on. So even if you have just some ways to trigger the Eerie every once in a while, I think it's worth playing. Yeah, I could just trade with a creature and then do damage to another creature and 2 for 1, which is really fun. But next up, we've got Piranha Fly. This is 1 blue and 1 for a 2/1 flying fish insect, but it enters tapped. I like this. As a common, it fills a niche. If you're low on 2-drops, you can pick it up late in a draft. Have an evasive creature. Sure, it enters tapped, but what more do you want for a common, right? But having an evasive 2/1 flying creature on 2, when otherwise you might be out of 2-drops, might not have enough 2-drops, you're looking for filler for that curve, right? It's late in a draft, that kind of thing. Nice little common here. It's gonna fill a very specific niche. Next up, we've got the Swarm Weaver. This is a 2/3 legendary artifact creature Scarecrow for 4 mana in the colors of Golgari. When it enters, you create 2 1/1 black and green insect creature tokens with flying. And then it also has Delirium, so as long as there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, insects and spiders you control get +1/+1 and have Death Touch. So again, Delirium, a lot easier to trigger here. In fact, if you end up playing a Swarm Weaver, it trades with something, or your opponent uses removal on it or whatever, and it goes to the graveyard, it's going to fulfill half of that Delirium all by itself, both artifact and creature. You're going to be up to 2 already just from this one card, and then you play your second copy and you're good. This is definitely one of those legendaries that I don't think you should be afraid of just running an entire playset of 4. Because worst case scenario, you play one dies to the legend rule, goes to the graveyard, and then turns on the Delirium for the other one. So really cool card. There's just so many different ways to use it too, like you can flicker it and keep getting more and more insects. The Delirium being a blanket effect for both insects and spiders is super fun. We've already seen some support for those tribal types in this set, and I'm really interested to see just how deep that goes. I hope we get a ton more support and they end up being, you know, reasonably reliable and constructed. If there's a constructed insect deck or spider deck, I'm going to be excited. I think that would be super fun. We've already seen Twitching Doll, which is an insanely good card for spider support, so this might pair up really, really well with that. I'm just excited to see where this goes in general, but if you've got ideas about how to use this, definitely let me know in the comments, because I think this card is super fun, and I just want to find as many different ways to brew with it as possible, to be honest. But next up, we've got Stay Hidden, Stay Silent. Are they trying to rip off Lord of the Rings? Keep it secret. Keep it safe. 1 blue and 1 for an enchantment aura. It enchants a creature. When it enters, you tap the enchanted creature. Enchanted creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. And then for 6 mana, a whopping 6 mana, which is a lot, you shuffle enchanted creature into its owner's library, and then you get to Manifest Dread, but activate only as a sorcery. Now, we've seen in prior cards that Manifest Dread means you look at the top 2 cards of your library, you pick one of them to come into play as a face-down 2/2 creature, the other one goes to your graveyard. So the fact that we have a very reasonable 2 mana piece of, like, keep a creature tapped style removal that is at the uncommon rarity that can be used in limited pretty easily is pretty decent in and of itself. Like, that's kind of what you're looking for as far as filling out your removal quota in limited, so to speak. But having extra value that's kind of free tacked onto it, a way to get rid of that creature forever if you're desperate, a way to get extra board presence on the board, a way to get something into the graveyard. Like, there's so many little bits of silver lining value just tacked on. And I'm used to seeing cards like this, especially at the common and uncommon rarity, that just do the thing, right? They just help you get rid of a creature, whether it be temporarily or forever or whatever the case may be. So having this do that for a reasonable cost, but also just give you extra value later in the game, give you extra options if even keeping it tapped on the battlefield ends up being problematic, extra options for getting rid of that creature for good. I just love all the versatility here and all of the extra value tacked on. So I think this is actually a very strong pick for removal if you're deep into blue in limited. I don't think it's quite good enough for constructed, but crazier things have happened, so we'll have to wait and see. Next up, we've got Acrobatic Cheerleader. This is another one of those survival cards. This is a 2/2 human survivor for 1 white and 1. I kind of love the flavor. They're going with, like, the horror tropes from 80s horror movies, right? Always one character in the gang is the Acrobatic Cheerleader. Kind of hilarious. Reminds me of Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, to be honest. But anyway, survival. At the beginning of your second main phase, if Acrobatic Cheerleader is tapped, you put a flying counter on it. This ability triggers only once. So, just needs to get through for combat just once. And if it does, it turns into a flyer for the rest of the game. This is pretty cool. It's nothing crazy, right? It's not supposed to be because it's a common, but I think it's a fun way to utilize the survival mechanic for a creature that is relevant, that will, you know, turn into a potential win condition that can be swinging in the air. So, again, another 2-drop common that's really good at filling that 2-drop slot if you're towards the end of a draft and you realize your curve's kind of coming up short in that department, you can do a lot worse than, you know, slamming an Acrobatic Cheerleader or two into that slot. Next up, we've got Central Elevator and Promising Stairs. This is another room card. So Central Elevator is 1 blue and 3, and when you unlock this door, you search your library for a room card that doesn't have the same name as a room you control. You reveal it, and then put it into your hand and shuffle. So it's like a tutor for rooms if you play the 4 mana side. The other side, Promising Stairs, is only 3 mana, and at the beginning of your upkeep you surveil one, and then you win the game if there are 8 or more different names among unlocked doors of rooms you control. So this is the payoff for the room deck. If you're going to go deep into rooms, like, this is the card. Not only does it tutor you up a missing room that you need, but it gives you a win condition for winning just by having enough rooms. And this is the card that made me realize that rooms are very similar to shrines, at least in the mindset and the way that R&D is approaching the development of the enchantment room cards, because they want you to really double down on rooms, right? They don't want you to just dip your toe into rooms and maybe add a couple room cards into a normal deck. They really want you to build around rooms, and this is probably the best payoff for that, and an enabler all in one. Like I said, it just reminds me of the way they approach shrines. There seems to be a lot of that same sentiment here in the room cards. That being said, a lot of the rooms are good at being just extra cards you can play in decks that aren't centered around rooms. And I think it's important that you have that, you know, versatility, and you're not too deep into only having to go one way with the cards and that they're, you know, unusable outside of that. But this one in particular is definitely all about going deep into rooms and making it a win condition, which makes sense because it's the elevator and the stairs. It's the way that you get around the mansion and all the different rooms. So thematically it's a win, mechanically it's a win. Will this be good enough to make a room deck viable and constructed? I don't know, but I hope so. I hope so, because it would be super fun. And if you first pick this in Limited, you probably try to build rooms around it, and that would be super fun. Hopefully that ends up being realistic enough to be viable. I'm just excited to see where this will go, and if it will be consistent enough to actually show up. I think it'll be cool. But next up, we've got Fanatic of the Harrowing. 1 black and 3 for a 2/2 creature human cleric. When it enters, each player discards a card. If you discarded a card this way, you get to draw a card. So again, common filler, comes in at 4, gets you some card advantage, makes them discard a card. You either play it when you're out of gas and don't have to discard anything, or if you play it before you're out of gas, you get to discard, you know, your worst card and then draw a card to replace it, so it's kind of a rummage effect. Not too bad. Getting to rummage, make them discard a card. It is card advantage. Again, it is just going to be filler and limited, though. It's definitely not going to be good enough to make the cut and constructed. But as a common, you know, you can pick it up late in the draft and fill out that curve. Next up, we've got Turn Inside Out. This is 1 red for an instant. Target creature gets +3/+0 until end of turn. When it dies this turn, you manifest Dread. This card seems nuts for a common. +3/+0 at instant speed for just 1 mana is already going to be a huge headache for the prowess decks, right? For the otter decks, for the slick shot decks, whatever the case may be. But getting this extra value of being able to manifest Dread when it dies is just... we're going to see this a lot, right? I'm pretty sure we're going to see this a lot. Mice can use this because they like being targeted by it. Getting a free 2/2 seems decent, especially in a deck where you have a bunch of cheap, low-to-the-ground creatures that are efficient and aggressive, because the 2/2 has that much more of a chance of being one of those creatures that can then flip up and be an even more relevant threat than just a vanilla 2/2. So, all in all, I think this card's actually really good. And I want to see... We'll have to wait and see it in action to see just how good, but the potential is there for this to be one of those, like, key 1-mana buff spells for the decks that want that. So we'll see. But next up, we've got Victor Valgavoth's Seneschal. This is a 3/3 legendary human warlock for 3 mana in the colors of Orzhov, and it has probably the best Eerie ability in the set. We don't know for sure yet. but it's definitely the best one we've seen so far. Whenever an enchantment you control enters, and whenever you fully unlock a room, you Surveil 2. If it's the first time this ability has resolved this turn. If it's the second, each opponent discards a card. If it's the third, you get to put any creature card from any graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So unlocking a room, unlocking 3 rooms is going to be very expensive, but playing 3 enchantments in the same turn, not all that difficult. We even already have a deck in Standard right now that does exactly that, or at least has the potential to, the Nurturing Pixie deck. So if you're playing a lot of those 1-drop enchantments that make the opponent discard, whether it's the Nightmare or Tiny Bones joins up or whatever, all of those really cheap enchantments that you want to return to your hand and replay with Nurturing Pixie, or maybe just, you know, put them out on the board and use them as sacrifice fodder for Rottenmouth Vipers, something like that. I've made a couple of those decks that I've put up on the channel. That deck just slots this in easy. If you just have 3 enchantments that are super cheap to play on the same turn, you get to bring back any creature from any graveyard, just take your opponent's Atraxa, or that you made them discard, or whatever. The fact that this slots so well into a discard deck allows you to Surveil 2 and make them discard a card kind of for free on the way to getting to that 3rd trigger. Means you're definitely going to have gas in graveyards to choose from when you do hit that 3rd trigger, even if you don't start with it that way, right? Surveiling 2, putting a key creature like a Rottenmouth Viper or a Vein Ripper or something like that into the graveyard to get back with this, making them discard their Atraxa or their Atali and getting it back on the 3rd trigger. You're already probably going to play a lot of discard cards with this, like the Hopeless Nightmare and Tiny Bones joins up, so you should be making them discard a lot of crazy stuff. Now they're going to be scared to discard their expensive stuff early, but also, like, what else are they going to discard early? Are they going to discard all of their early plays and be stuck with an Atraxa in their hand that they can't play just because they're scared of you stealing it from their graveyard? I think this card is awesome. We have to rebuild Nurturing Pixie with this card for sure, and I'm excited to even dip into potentially exploring it in other decks as well, maybe even a room deck, even though I do think unlocking rooms is going to be a more expensive route to go, and probably a less consistent route to go. The potential's there, and we haven't seen all of the room cards yet, so we have no way of really knowing how realistic that could be. So I'm excited to see where we can go with this, but we're definitely going to brew it because there's some crazy shenanigans you can get up to with this card. Moving on, we've got Slavering Branchsnapper. This is a 7/6 lizard with trample for 2 green and 4, and it has forest cycling too. I've already said that I kind of love these common cards that you can pick up pretty easily and limited, that can be a late game huge threat, game ending threat, or early game fixing. The versatility there is awesome. It's never going to be a dead card in your hand because you don't have enough mana to play it, right? It can always be that fixing worst case scenario. So this is just as good in the same ways. And yeah, this is going to be a very highly played common in limited for sure. It's possible it makes the cut in some kind of a weird constructed reanimator deck or something. Helps you, you know, find your lands, make your land drops while also giving you fodder in the graveyard. That being said, I think the quality of creatures we have available to us to get back from graveyards these days is just so high that it won't quite make the cut. But it's nice that it enables itself, right? It puts itself in the graveyard so that it's ready to bring back. So I'm not going to count it out completely, but probably not. But in limited, this guy's a beast. Well, a lizard. Can we use it in Lizard Tribal? Maybe. Next up, we've got Ethereal Armor. Ethereal Armor? Ethereal Armor. 1 white mana for an enchantment aura. It enchants a creature. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each enchantment you control and has first strike. This card's really good. Granted, it doesn't have any built-in 2-for-1 advantage, doesn't replace itself, anything like that. So it does have the old, historically tried and true card disadvantage problem that a lot of auras used to have back in the day, where you put it on your creature, and then your opponent kills your creature. Now they 2-for-1'd you. They got your creature off the board and your enchantment off the board by just using 1 removal spell. That being said, it's just a 1-drop, right? So if there's going to be any kind of enchantment whatsoever that's worth that risk of, you know, getting 2-for-1'd, a 1-drop that can turn any creature into a ridiculous win condition in the right deck with First Strike is probably going to be the card to, you know, be worth playing. So I think this card's awesome. I think enchantments in Standard are going to be bananas, and I would not be surprised if this ends up being a part of that deck, and definitely in Limited. There's tons of enchantment potential in this set in Limited, so you're definitely going to see this popping up. I don't know exactly how many different types of enchantment deck archetypes we're going to see, but I have a feeling there's going to be more than just the enchantment deck. I think there's a lot of different ways enchantments are going to go in this set because there's so many different enchantments and different approaches to enchantments. So I think there's actually going to end up being a number of archetypes this could end up slotting really well into, but we'll have to wait and see. Next up, we've got Mirror Room and Fractured Realm. This is another enchantment room card. So Mirror Room is 3 mana, 1 blue and 2 for an enchantment room. When you unlock this door, you create a token that's a copy of target creature you control, except it's a reflection in addition to its other creature types. So it's kind of the best clone ever. It's just a 3 mana, make a copy of whatever you want, right? But it comes attached with just extra value. Fractured Realm is an enchantment room, the other half, that you can unlock or play from your hand for 2 blue and 5, so a total of 7 mana. If a triggered ability of a permanent you control triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. So it's kind of having like a clone and a Panharmonicon just in the same card. The fact that you can get one side first and then just wait and play the other side later just gives you an insane amount of value on this card. It's that good, and that's why it's a mythic, right? Either one of these sides by itself wouldn't be that impressive. But the fact that you get both, and you know, one of them at least can be very reasonably costed. It's technically even 1 mana less than what the traditional clone costs at 1 blue and 3. So being able to get a somewhat cheaper clone and then just have access to turning on this Fractured Realm later on is just free value, in my opinion, and could be pretty insane in the right deck. That being said, you do have to be careful with how you play this card, because you only unlock the door if you play it from your hand or pay the mana cost. So if you did something like return this from the graveyard to play, it doesn't come in with anything unlocked, which means it's actually going to be detrimental and cost you even more mana in the long run if you're trying to like cheat it into play and do stuff like that. So you got to be careful. You definitely want to play one side first, probably the Mirror Room, and then unlock the other side. So it is going to require you actually spending the mana, no matter what. You can't really cheat. That being said, in a lot of decks, that Fractured Realm is just going to be extra, right? And it's really, really good extra. So I'm excited to see just how deep we can go with these. Just loving the way these rooms are working. If you've got a way you want to use this card, definitely let me know in the comments, because I'm excited to hear what direction you guys want to take with some of these cards. But moving on, we've got Pyroclasm. Pyroclasm is back. This is 1 red and 1. It deals 2 damage to each creature. Very simple card, but it'll be very good at dealing with a lot of token creatures on the board and that sort of thing. Just a nice little piece of removal here to help you catch back up against a very aggressive deck. And I'm glad to see it come back, at least for Limited. Next up, we've got Say Its Name. This is 1 green and 1 for a sorcery. You mill 3 cards, then you may return a creature or land card from your graveyard to your hand. You also exile this card and 2 other cards named Say Its Name from your graveyard, and you get to search your graveyard, hand, and or library for a card named Altanok the Thrice-Called and put it onto the battlefield. If you search your library this way, you shuffle, activate only as a sorcery. I love the flavor here. It's obviously a Candyman reference, right? You say the name 3 times and it appears kind of thing. But I like that you get value early, and then you have this potential to get this craziness later on, right? Milling 3 cards, getting any creature or land back to your hand has its place, and there are certain decks that are definitely going to want to do that, self-mill decks and stuff like that. And then you just get enough cards into the graveyard, and you just exile them all. You don't even have to pay the mana. That's what's crazy about it. And we'll get to what Altanok the Thrice-Called is later, but it is a very substantial threat if you can get it out reasonably early. So I think there is potential here, even in Constructed, to have some kind of a crazy self-mill deck where you can get to 3 of these in the graveyard very easily, and then get out some real beef. But we'll have to circle back to that idea when we get to that card. It's just a little bit later. So moving on, we've got Leyline of Transformation. This is 2 blue and 2 for an enchantment. This is definitely my favorite Leyline that I've seen so far, and I'm super excited to brew with it. If Leyline of Transformation is in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it on the battlefield. As Leyline of Transformation enters, you choose a creature type. Creatures you control are the chosen type, in addition to their other types. The same is true for creature spells you control and creature cards you own that aren't on the battlefield. I kind of love this card. So, being able to get all of the different tribal payoffs that we just saw in Bloomburrow. There's so many different tribal payoffs for so many different animal tribes. The idea of starting with Leyline of Transformation on the battlefield and just playing every single one of those payoffs, and all of those creatures are giving each other of those creatures all of those payoffs at the same time because they're all every creature type, is just insane. And we definitely have to do it. And normally, that kind of a deck would very much be kind of a meme, would be kind of jank. But what's awesome about Leyline of Transformation, not only can it start in play at the beginning of the game if you have it in your opening hand, but there's more consistency to doing it with this card because you have access to Beseech the Mirror. So for 4 mana, we can sacrifice an enchantment or an artifact or a token, and we can just search for Leyline of Transformation, put it on the battlefield. So if we've got 4 Beseech the Mirror and 4 Leylines in the deck, the consistency of being able to get this out and turn every creature into every creature type actually goes way, way up. And also, the Beseech the Mirror isn't a dead card if we've already got a Leyline of Transformation on the battlefield. We can use it to fetch other things, and we can even, if we're desperate, sacrifice the Leyline of Transformation to the Beseech the Mirror to pay for the bargain cost to find something else if we really need to. So I think Beseech the Mirror with Leyline of Transformation in a deck where you're just utilizing every creature payoff seems like it could be insane. There might be a bit more of a down-to-earth approach in using this card, so if you have ideas of using this card in a more realistic sense, definitely let me know in the comments. I just think that the potential is so insane, and I would love to just jam all of the ridiculous tribal payoffs that came in Bloomburrow, and some that were even around before Bloomburrow, just all in the same deck, and just go to town. I think it would be super fun, especially when you actually pull off a win. The look on your opponent's face would be priceless. We're going to brew it for sure. How consistent will it be? Will it be good enough? I'm not sure. We're going to have to test it out to see. But definitely having Beseech the Mirror and that line that we can do if we don't start with Leyline of Transformation in our opening hand definitely increases the chances of that deck being viable. And I'm excited to just dive in. Early access, guys. We're going to do the damn thing. But next up, we've got Shard Mage's Rescue. 1 white for an enchantment aura with flash. You enchant a creature you control. As long as Shard Mage's Rescue entered this turn, enchanted creature has hexproof, and enchanted creature gets +1/+1. So this is really, really good enchantment payoff that you can save your dude from removal. It's one of those typical instant speed 1 mana spells that saves your guy from removal, gives it hexproof and that sort of thing. But then it sticks around as an enchantment aura, buffs your dude by +1/+1, and counts as an enchantment for all of the things you care about. All of those eerie cards that we've talked about already, this is just a 1 mana way at instant speed to trigger eerie. So that alone makes it really good. I think just a way of giving your creature hexproof and saving it from removal for 1 mana at instant speed that's going to count as playing an enchantment and stick on the board is huge. So I love this card. I think it might even show up in Constructed. It's just great. Next up, we've got Altenak the Thrice-Called. Now, this is the thing that we can fetch if we have the 3 cards, say your name, and we exile all 3 of them from the graveyard. This is a 7 mana, 9/9 legendary insect beast with trample. And when it becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you draw a card. Not only that, but you can pay 2 mana and discard it from your hand to return target land from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So all of those cards that you're self-milling to try to get 3 of the Say My Name cards into the graveyard at the same time, Now you could just discard this guy to get him back, and it doesn't even matter that it's discarded, because when you exile those 3 cards from your graveyard to put him into play for free, you can find him in your graveyard. You don't have to find him out of your hand or in your library, so getting extra value, getting to discard him to get extra value early for cheap, and not having to worry about keeping him in your hand as a dead card that you're just waiting to eventually get the payoff to get out for free, is amazing. Like, discarding him, getting a land back, self-milling all those cards in your graveyard, and then getting a free 9/9 Trampler that just draws you cards when your opponent targets it with a spell or ability. I think it's awesome. I honestly think it might be constructed viable. I want to try to build this in constructed. It's definitely going to be a really fun build around in limited. I'm curious to see if it's actually viable in limited, if there's enough of those cards to make it viable. Having only 40 card decks does make it a little bit more reasonable to potentially see more copies of it, and you're not limited to 4 copies in limited of something. So if you draft 5 or 6 of them, which I don't know how realistic that is, but if you happen to draft like 5 or 6 of them, you can run them all, and your deck's only 40 cards, so you're that much more likely to actually draw into them. So there is potential for this to be somewhat realistic in limited. I'm excited to see if it is, but I really want to challenge myself to build this in constructed. It would be a super, super fun, possibly even a budget deck that's competitive with the meta decks if there's enough support for it. So I'm going to try to build it early access. Let's do the thing, just like every other deck I've brought up in this video. Man, 24-hour marathon stream, guys. We're going to stream nonstop and try out all of these decks. It's going to be bananas, so I hope to see you there. But next up, we've got Nico, Light of Hope. And I kind of love this card. This is a 3/4 legendary human wizard for 4 mana in the colors of Azorius. When Nico enters, you create 2 shard tokens. Now, if you don't remember, we got a Nico Planeswalker a while back that made these same shard tokens, and I'm pretty sure that's the only other card that ever made them. They are enchantment tokens that are similar to clue tokens. Instead of being artifact tokens, they're enchantment tokens. You pay 2, sack them, but instead of just drawing a card like a clue, you scry one and then draw a card. So they're strictly better than clues, and they count as enchantments for everything that cares about enchantments, which means this guy entering the battlefield immediately gets you 2 eerie triggers, because 2 enchantment tokens are created immediately. But then he also has another ability, pay 2, tap, exile target non-legendary creature you control. Shards you control become copies of it until the beginning of the next end step, and then you return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. This just seems insane in a Flicker deck. If you're in a Flicker deck, you can Flicker Nico to get more shard tokens, but then you also have the ability to use Nico to Flicker other things that are other Flicker payoffs in the deck by paying 2 mana and tap it. And when you do, not only do you get to Flicker the thing, it comes back in at end of turn and gets any ETB triggers, but also while it's gone, all of your shard tokens become whatever left. So if you have some really, really crazy Flicker targets that can get you ETB value, but are also really strong creatures in their own right, turning all of your shard tokens into copies of those creatures seems insane. Now, what I'm wondering is, with the impending enchantment creatures, if you play them for their impending cost, and then you Flicker them with Nico, do they come back in as the creature version? And regardless of whether they come back in as the creature version, do they turn all of the shard tokens into creature versions, since technically none of them will have time counters on them? I think the answer to both of those is yes. I'm not going to say for sure, I'm not 100%, but it seems to me like, yes, that's the way to go, and that is insanely abusable with Nico. So I kind of want to make a deck that uses all of the impending creatures, and Nico, and Xur for those synergies that we already talked about. It just seems like there's a ton of potential, and you can clearly start to see why Nico is a mythic card. The last piece of the puzzle that I really want to find out is, are we going to get more cards in this set that give us more shard token support? Are there more cards that make shard tokens, or is this going to be another one and done, just like when we got the Nico Planeswalker, and it's the only thing that can make shard tokens? That's really going to determine whether this is really good or just absolutely insane. So hopefully we do. If I had to guess, I'd say probably we don't, because there's so many ways to just bust this wide open even without more shard support. But man, if we get more cards with shard support that can create shard tokens in other ways, this card is just going to be busted. I'm already super excited to try and build some kind of a Blink Flicker deck with Nico at its core. Yeah, this is just awesome. We have so many things to try out during early access. It's going to be nuts. Is there anything that I overlooked, ways to break this, that I didn't bring up? Because there's just so much potential, it seems. So let me know in the comments. But next up, we've got 𝐿𝒂𝒂𝒻𝑠 Faithful. This is 1 black for a 1/1 human cleric, and you can pay 4 mana and sacrifice it to return a target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, but activate only as a sorcery. Love this card as well. You get it out early as a 1/1, and if it can just stick there until turn 4, you have a 4 mana way of reanimating any creature onto the battlefield. And thematically, it fits really well with 𝐿𝒂𝒂𝒻𝑠 himself, because it is a huge, ridiculous win condition that's really expensive, that is the absolute perfect target for reanimation spells, to come back early, to be cheated out early through reanimation spells. So having an uncommon here that thematically supports that and mechanically supports that is really interesting. I'm not sure how good it ends up being in the long run in like things like Constructed. It might be too fragile, or it might be a way to just, you know, get them to waste removal early because they're scared about what you might do on turn 4. So maybe it does see play in Constructed. Maybe you play it on 1, now your opponent gets paranoid and ends up killing it, wasting really good removal on your silly 1-drop just because they're afraid of what you can do with it later. So I don't know. We're going to have to wait and see what the whole set entails and what kind of decks come out of this, but the potential is there for it to be used in Constructed. And in Limited, I'm excited about the idea of actually being able to build into some kind of a Reanimator archetype, where maybe you can draft a couple of these and really have the consistency of doing that go up. So, very fun card. Next up, we've got another enchantment room. This is Smoky Lounge and Misty Salon. Smoky Lounge is a enchantment room for 1 red and 2, and at the beginning of your first main phase, you add 2 red to your mana pool, but you can only spend that mana to cast room spells and unlock doors. So we see even more support for the Rooms Matter deck archetype, and this is an uncommon, so it's even more proof that that might be a viable archetype in Limited specifically, because this is going to be more prevalent in Limited, and you're definitely going to want to be able to get use out of Smoky Lounge. The other side is Misty Salon, 1 blue and 3, and when you unlock this door, create an XX blue spirit creature token with flying, where X is the number of unlocked doors among rooms you control. So even more payoff and enabling, which we saw with one of the other rooms we checked out in this video, where one side was really good payoff for going deep into rooms, and the other side was a really good enabler. We're seeing something similar here at the uncommon level, where one side's an enabler, helps give you mana that you can use every turn to unlock doors or play rooms, and then the other side is a payoff for having as many rooms as possible unlocked. So I kind of love that they're digging deep into this as an archetype, hopefully in Limited. I really hope it's viable. I really hope there's enough support that it's consistent enough, because it could be super fun to actually draft into this in Limited. And I'm still holding out hope, crossing my fingers, that an actual room deck is constructed viable, is standard viable, because I just think it'll be so fun to do something so different and so new if it can stand toe-to-toe with the meta in standard. So my fingers are crossed. I'm hoping, because this could be really amazing. But next up, we've got the Big Daddy himself, the Meathook Massacre Part 2, the sequel. It's back. I've seen a lot of people talk about this card today, and they don't think it's that good, and I think they're really missing the point of the card. This is a legendary enchantment for 4 black and XX. When it enters, each player sacrifices X creatures. Whenever a creature you control dies, you may pay 3 life. If you do, you return that card under your control with a finality counter on it. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, they may pay 3 life, and if they don't, you get to return that card under your control with a finality counter on it as well. This card is busted, man. This card is insane. What you have to do in order to evaluate this card properly, forget that the 𝑥 side exists. Just completely forget about that. All of that is extra. When you look at this, you immediately want to compare it to the first Meathook Massacre, and in doing so, you look at the potential to be a sweeper, and it looks underwhelming, and I feel like everybody's looking at it that way and evaluating the card wrong. Forget that it exists. This is a 4 black mana enchantment that gives you 2 abilities. 1, all of your removal deals an extra 3 damage to the opponent's head unless they give you the creature that you killed. So it's either a control magic that's probably a lot cheaper than a control magic, or the same as whatever removal spell it always was, except it also just gets the added text, they lose 3 life. Every single removal spell also makes the opponent lose 3 life. That's insane. That is crazy, crazy, crazy. And then every creature you have now has a second life. None of them can be killed without them coming back onto the battlefield for round 2. Getting both of those abilities on the same enchantment for 4 mana is already nuts. So when you take that as your core, and now you say, oh, also, by the way, if you happen to get this later in the game where you have a ton of mana, it's got this 𝑥 thing you can do too, where you can make your opponent sacrifice creatures. Actually, both players, right? All players sacrifice X creatures. So it's got this way of being a pseudo sweeper as well as just silver lining value if it's later in the game and you happen to have the mana. That's nuts. And then you add to this the fact that you can run it with Nurturing Pixie in those types of decks, play it for 4 mana early, and then if the game drags on and your opponent's amassing a board and you're worried, you can return the Meathook Massacre to your hand with a Nurturing Pixie, and then replay it with the 𝑥 to make them sacrifice creatures. And even them sacrificing just 1 or 2 creatures is huge because of the other static abilities. When you play it, everything you sacrifice to it just comes back with a finality counter. Everything they sacrifice to it, they immediately have to give to you unless they take 3 damage. So if you end up paying, 4 mana into the 𝑥 and make them sacrifice 2 creatures, they have to also lose 6 life or give you both of those creatures. That's just insane payoff to be built in when you take into account the fact that you're just going to be firing off removal spells left and right after this thing is down anyway, and constantly forcing them to make that same decision over and over again. And in a standard environment where it's hard to stay alive past turn 4, paying 3 life to make it so that you don't get the creature is a lot to ask. Probably too much to ask. So I think this card's going to be insane. I think it's flying under the radar. I don't think it's broken like the first Meathook Massacre. I do think they're being careful to balance it out and make it not busted, because the first one was clearly just a little too good. So that's why it is so expensive. It does have a high amount of, a mana requirement, a black mana requirement. It's 𝑥. I do think they are kind of covering their butts and making sure it's not busted or not bannable. They don't have to ban it like the last one. But that being said, it's still really good, and it's absolutely going to see play in the right decks. You just got to think about it in the right context. So you got to treat the sweeper portion of it, the sacrifice portion of it, as an extra, and really build decks around this that, hone in on those 2 static abilities, because that's where it's really going to shine as a 4-drop. And I think the potential is there for this just to be insane. So if you've got ideas to just even further bend or break this card, definitely let me know in the comments. I'm going to be brewing with it. I'm going to be surprising a lot of people with how good it ends up being. I know it. I can just see it coming. But yeah, join me for early access, because we're going to do it. Next up, we've got Inquisitive Glimmer. This is 2 mana for a 2/3 enchantment Fox Glimmer in the colors of Azorius. And when it's on the battlefield, enchantment spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, but also unlock costs you pay cost 1 less as well. And that makes this pretty cool. A 2/3 for 2 is already kind of decent, especially when it, counts as an enchantment, because there's a lot of stuff in this set that cares about enchantments. Just playing this is going to trigger Eerie, which is really nice. But being able to double down on that cost reduction, have it apply to unlocks, makes it that much better. This is perfect for Eerie decks, but it's going to be useful in enchantment decks in general that are just going to want to get that cost reduction. I think if the room deck ends up being a real thing in Standard, this will actually make the cut and be a key part of that because it reduces your costs by a substantial amount. One room card essentially gets a 2 mana cost reduction because it's going to get that cost reduction when you initially play the room, and then it's also going to get an additional cost reduction when you unlock it. So keep that in mind. I am excited to use this in Limited for sure, but what I'm really curious about is if that room deck is going to be a thing in Constructed, because if it is, I think this will be a part of it. And next up, we have the last card spoiled today. This is another room. This is Funeral Room and Awakening Hall. So Funeral Room is an enchantment room for 1 black and 2. Whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So not a ton of value there, but a nice little bit of extra life drain that triggers literally anytime a creature you control dies. Super useful in any kind of sacrifice decks, which I do think are going to be pretty viable in Standard after this set releases. So that first side could actually end up being a little bit more viable, a little bit more impressive than it looks on first inspection. And then Awakening Hall is a whopping 8 mana, 2 black and 6 for the other side of the enchantment room. When you unlock this door, you return all creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. So getting a nice little bit of payoff in a sacrifice deck to constantly drain them, to get the clock lower, get them closer to dead while keeping yourself alive so that you can get to the 8 mana you need to then unlock this final side. Bring back all of that stuff you sacrificed and have it all ready to sacrifice again and just win outright seems bananas. But even just the potential of using this in a traditional Reanimator deck as a way to bring back your entire graveyard could be nuts as well if we can find ways to get the costs down. We did just see that enchantment creature in Azorius that can reduce the costs of unlocking things. That gets this from 8 to 7, which ends up being a little bit more reasonable. Is there maybe a ramp deck that can use this? I'm not sure, but I definitely feel like there's going to be some way to make that 8 cost seem more reasonable and make it a little bit more viable. You got to remember, you can't just cheat these into play anyway. You have to be able to pay that cost in order to unlock the room. So it's not as simple as getting it into the graveyard and returning it from the graveyard to the battlefield because you didn't pay the cost, right? So I'm really curious how we can break that second side, but even without breaking it, just in a fair sacrifice deck, I think this could end up being really, really good with 2 really good benefits under the right circumstances. But there's got to be another way, right? If you've got ideas, definitely let me know in the comments how you want to use this card, because the potential is definitely there, and we got to find a new way of cheating things out where we're still paying their mana costs, so that we can make sure Awakening Hall gets unlocked. So I'm all ears if you've got ideas, but we'll definitely be exploring it in early access for sure. But that's it for today. As if it wasn't enough, day 2 and day 3 crammed into one video. It's a lot. So if you made it all the way to the end of the video, let me know by commenting down below with "Yo, I stuck it out," or something like that. I don't know. So that I know that you guys stuck it out all the way to the end of the video, because I appreciate everybody that does stay to the end of my videos. It means a lot to me. Make sure you like the video if you haven't already. It helps this video get out to so many more people, and it's a lot of work putting these together, so I would appreciate it if we could get this out to more people, get more eyes on it. It would mean a lot to me. Subscribe if you haven't already so you never miss an upload. Like I said before, tons and tons of craziness is coming very soon. I've got a full-time editor now. My boy Fingon is helping me out with edits, and I appreciate it so much. So I'm editing this one myself, but all the deck texts and a lot of the spoiler shorts that are going up, Finn's helping out with the editing, and I'm super appreciative for that. So thank you, Finn. Give him a shout out in the comments for being so helpful, even though he didn't edit this one. So I don't know why I'm asking you guys to thank him in this video in particular, but I don't know, I just happened to think of it. So thanks, Finn, because with him doing some of the other work, it freed up enough time for me to make this video. So thank you, Finn. I'll see you guys tomorrow for more spoilers and more shenanigans. I'll see you then. I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Wonders of the First. Wonders of the First is a brand new collectible card game similar to games like Magic the Gathering, Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon, featuring a unique action-based resource economy that helps avoid pitfalls like mana flood or mana screw, and a battlefield containing multiple realms that unlock over time as you fight for control of the stones. The first 400 card set is called Existence and will launch to retail in the fall, but playtest team starter kits are available to order now. And they haven't forgotten about all you collectors out there. The game contains alternate borderless art variants, as well as highly sought after limited edition numbered prints, culminating in a one-of-one stone foil. And the best part is that the developers have a community-first approach, with 8 print-and-play decks available on their website, as well as a version of the game available on Tabletop Simulator, all for free. For more information, be sure to check out wondersccg.com today. That's wondersccg.com. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck text, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.